Hello, my name is Aaron Heldreth, and this is the presentation for my book review on a book called Invent to Learn for our Education 407 Technology and Digital Literacy. The authors for this book are Sylvia Martinez and Gary Steger. Instead of talking about some of their particular pedagogy, I decided just to list a couple of the quotes that they had from the book. The first one is, "Learning is often confused with education." Learning. So we'll get a little bit more into that later. "Through engagement, design, and building, the best way to understand circles is to reinvent the wheel." I think that really showcases how they feel about the idea of learning. First of all, learning, just thinking about the idea of thinking. And second, talking about understanding circles and reinventing the wheel. They're basically saying, get in there, get your hands dirty, actually physically touching things, moving things. The second quote from the authors was actually a quote from Piaget, which is that Piaget reminds us that knowledge is the consequence of experience. So again, going back to physically doing something. So moving from their direct quotes, I'll go into a few of their main ideas. The main ideas of the book were that they love makerspace, anything making, tinkering, engineering, inventing, anything being hands-on. They didn't specifically get into exactly the whole STEM section. They did touch on those categories, but this book wasn't STEM or STEAM derivative or driven. It was just certain portions of it had that, but I like that it was all encompassing. So what I chose to do for the main ideas to cover for this review was to break it apart into a few different sections, how I kind of saw the book. I chose to break it apart into three main sections, one being the students, and then I broke the teacher into two sections, one in a more direct role in the classroom, and then the third and final was the teacher again, but from an overhead view. So under the students portion, I pulled out a couple of the chapters that I thought were really good, and there's the thinking about thinking, which again is touching back from the original quote, learning. Game changers is another great one that I saw from the text, where they kind of went into a few different particular sections that actually talked about some different ideas and things you could implement in the classroom that could be game changers for particular students or in particular subject areas. Then for the teacher, the first portion was in the classroom, or how I saw it. So I chose a couple of the chapters, one on what makes a good project, and then actually teaching. Then from the overhead view, the author also touches on making the case. So it kind of goes into making the case not just for why makerspace is important in general for kids to be able to learn, but how you can make that case to parents, to the community, to your administration, etc. And then also it follows up with a list of resources that give a lot of great ideas and tools to use for the future. So the first section we'll go into is about the students, which is thinking about thinking, is chapter 3 from the text. How are we teaching children how or what to think? So it was a great chapter just on nothing but the process of thinking patterns, how we're teaching kids and children how to make those associations on knowing how to even formulate the right questions to ask. It does touch on the scientific method as a good, starting point, but basically from there we kind of have started falling short. One kind of example that I had was about building a bridge. So if I asked you as an adult, if I asked you to build a bridge, then what would be some questions that you would ask? What would you maybe ask for? What would you maybe ask about? Certain things like, how much money do I have? What kind of materials can I use? What does the bridge need to hold? Those are some questions that you may think about all on your own. But the idea of asking that question is it's supposed to make you think. And so the idea is, how are we engaging the children in the same way to get them to be able to think of those questions on their own? So we don't have to ask them the question, well, students, can you build a bridge that can hold this much weight? Instead, just pulling it back a little bit farther and letting them develop the questions on their own. The next portion that I really liked was the game changer section on chapter 7. The authors went into kind of 3 main areas. One was being fabrication. That section was on 3D printers and the CAD system, where children can actually, program in information into either CAD or a 3D printer and physically make something. That part was really exciting. The physical computing is either like Raspberry Pi or Arduino. Those can be used for something as simple as, let's say, a computer game, an arcade system, or running some sort of a robot, or there's a lot of neat things that you can do with those different systems. And then they also touched on programming. So they went very, very in depth and gave a lot of examples, but a couple of them were Scratch and Squeak. So the basic programming is just actually speaking the language for computers or some form of technology to be able to speak. So you're inputting that in sets of sequences so that they can understand it. So I thought all of those were definitely great sections to highlight. The teacher in the classroom portion, the what makes a good project. So I liked that because it talked about stressing the importance of highlighting why the work matters. What are you doing? Why does this matter to the student? Why does this matter in life? It gives them a sense of responsibility and ownership over their learning. Planning to make sure that you have all of your resources there. Everything is thought of as much as possible so that way it can go as smoothly as possible. And also raising our standards. Raising the standards for us as teachers, but also raising the standards for the students. Don't just naturally assume that maybe something is too difficult. Let them try to work it out as far as they can on their own, which kind of rolls right into the next section with the actual teaching portion, which goes to less us, more them. So they specifically talked about, before you want to intervene in any of the projects, how could you step back and say, how could I still, address this same idea, but without directly, inserting myself into this thinking process right now, trying to get it to where the students can develop all that learning on their own without having to be guided quite so much. They also touched on a couple other great ideas. You can't get it right without getting it wrong. It is okay to fail. That's part of learning, and also taking your time with everything that you're doing. They also highlighted, a whole list of 8 different big ideas, but those were the 3 main ones that I took away from it. So the teacher from the overhead, again, touching back on the making the case, that's in chapter 12. It brings in the whole community. So it talks about, how to address the issue of a makerspace or tinkering with the students. It talks about how to bring it up with parents and with, different faculty. And one other big portion that I liked, it also brought up different scenarios. Like if you were talking to, say, your administration about getting funding, to create a makerspace, different ways that you could reword certain phrases or questions that you may have in order to get more likely, returns or better answers to the questions that you're seeking. And lastly, there was a list of resources on chapter 14 that went into the ideas, materials, projects, all that kind of stuff. And then also in chapter 8, that also tied in with the game changer in chapter 7. It was called Stuff, and that also had another list of materials that you could, get that would be more directly tied into some of those game changer ideas. My analysis overall, I thought it was a really great book. It had a lot of amazing resources, toolbox. It hit on a lot of amazing lists, materials, ideas. I like how they framed everything in real-world context and the importance of makerspace, tinkering, all that. The only negative I would say that I found with it would be that was the scope of the work. It was so big. There was so much information that I kind of found it sometimes getting a little bit lost. It was well organized, but if you were looking to, say, do one exact project, this would be, a starting point for you. This wouldn't be an ending place. You wouldn't go to this book to find how to make a lesson plan for, X subject. This would only be your starting point. Then you'd have to go to 3 or 4 other places after this. It's an amazing first starting point, but, you do still have to continue on at other places. So that would be the only real fault that I would find with the book. In conclusion, they did a great job covering the idea, makerspace, tinkering, inventing. They stressed the importance of hands-on learning, how to make and facilitate amazing projects, ideas on where to get the materials and resources, and definitely that they stressed to let the children learn while we guide them in the right direction. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.